What if our world is their heaven? Time to look at Philip K. Dick's Dr. Bloodmoney, or How We Got Along After the Bomb. And this is a copy I bought second-hand. Probably, this is sort of mid-80s, and it got reissued sort of late 80s in Arrow, and this is a previous edition. And look at that, it's seen lots of wear. You can see another one there, because recently I've been doing some upgrading of my PKD paperbacks in some cases. We'll come on to that as like a bonus on the end of this. So if we go back to 1965, what happened then in Dick's publication sort of history, the writing was often different order to things being published. We had two books out that year, the very famous Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch, and that came out as a double-day hardcover. This of course is a Granada paperback from the early 80s, and also Dr. Bloodmoney. And I say, as I upgraded, this is a spiffing sort of newish copy which I managed to find. And I don't think Dr. Bloodmoney was ever done as a hardcover, except maybe Greg Press did one later on. And because the Greg Press books are printed in small quantities, didn't get the UK, they're quite collectible, as are most Dick hardcovers before a certain date. So one to watch out for. So Dr. Bloodmoney is a book which is much discussed amongst serious sort of Dick scholars and Dick fans, but it's one of those things that he sort of falls in the background because of course he's a lot more famous now than he was when he was alive. He was a Blade Runner and what have you, and all the other films. And really the books which get talked about a lot of us here, Androids, Ubik, Three Stigmata, Man in the High Castle, and then there are really important things which are discussed. Varlis gets discussed a lot, of course, often I think to the detriment of Dick's oeuvre generally. Scanner Darkly, because of course there was that rather nice rotoscoped film. And there's sort of two things which aren't discussed so much, which are really, really important books, of Dr. Bloodmoney and Martian Time Slip, which I think is amazing. And I've just reread Dr. Bloodmoney after a massive, massive hiatus. It's only the second time I've read it, I think. So if I read it sort of circa 85, it's that long, but it really is a book that really stays with you. And the question is it a masterpiece? I think some of Dick's more prominent European critics like Suvin and Stanislaw Lem felt that, you know, it was a masterpiece. I certainly think it's very important, but I want to talk about it today. It had a massive impact on me when I first read it, and it's certainly a key work. And I just really wanted to sort of have an excuse to go back to it. So the channel is that excuse, really. So, of course, the title, Dr. Bloodmoney, or How We Got Along After the Bomb, is a direct reference to Stanley Kubrick's film Dr. Strangelove, or How We Got Along Before the Bomb. And of course, a satirical film based on the novel Red Alert by Peter George, very good SF film. I struggle with it because even though I love Kubrick, I really, really dislike Peter Sellers. I think he's a total ham. I know it's a satire, but I really, really didn't like him as a man, and I really, really don't like his actor. I think he was very average, and I wouldn't have cast him. He's too broad in the humorous aspect. I think somebody a bit more genuinely maniacal would have been better, but that's just me. But yeah, Red Alert by Peter George, filmed as Dr. Strangelove. And Dick obviously was referencing that directly. Now, that's an unusual thing for an SF novel at that time to have a recursive reference in its title to SF cinema. So that shows Dick obviously thought the film was excellent and worthwhile, and he responded to the satirical elements. And of course, it is about nuclear war, and this is a post-apocalyptic novel, though it doesn't start that way. So basically, in Kubrick's film, Peter Sellers plays an insane Nazi rocket scientist, and of course the USA and the Soviets, when they both closed in from either side during World War II on the Peenemünde rocket plant where slave labour was employed to make the V2, the Doodlebug, the rocket that was fired at Britain as the sort of last chance for the Nazis to crush the UK, you know, they basically divided the scientists up, and the Americans got there first, and they took Werner von Braun, who was a member of the Nazi party, but he supposedly kept that going and joined it just so he could work on the rocketry. So there you go, the dream of space travel is born in forced labour camps. And interestingly, in the USSR, they had Sergei Korolev, the chief engineer, whose name wasn't known to the public till long after he died. And he, at one point in the 1930s, had been denounced by a friend who he later worked with on rocketry. And he was in a gulag, and they pulled him out of there eventually to get back to work on the Russian sort of space program, the chief engineer. So mankind's dream of space travel has been tainted from the start in a very Burroughsian way, in a very Barry Malzberg way, that entirely chimes with Malzberg's work in the initial astronaut trilogy and J.G. Ballard's kind of command module capsule fatigue stories, which are collected in Memoirs of the Space Age. But to get back to PKD, you have this figure of the insane Nazi scientist. The titular character of Dr. Bloodmoney is a chap called Bruno Blethgeld, and Blethgeld, blut, means blood, and geld, as we say in English, means money. So Dr. Bloodmoney. So it's a direct reference to the Kubrick film. And it also prefigures Dick's usage of a Germanic rendering of his own name, Horselover Fat, in Valis. And he was a classical music buff as well, of course, Dick was, and he was familiar with the German romantic composers, everybody from Beethoven to Wagner. And this references, of course, to Mozart in the character Luba Luft in Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep. And she's quite a voluptuous sort of android character, and she isn't in the film Blade Runner. The equivalent would be Zora, the sort of snake lady, as it were. So you do have all these sort of intersectional things happening. So Bruno Blethgeld, Dr. Bloodmoney, is the titular character of the novel. And again, there's a reference there to the Kubrick film. So the interesting thing about Dr. Bloodmoney is that it's unusual in Dick's SF oeuvre in that it begins like a mainstream novel. The other cardinal example of this, of course, is Time Out of Joint from the end of the 50s, which is his first major SF novel, a superb book, and we'll cover that on the channel at some point. That's the one which supposedly influenced The Truman Show, and you can see it there, really. So it begins like a mainstream novel. It has got a novum in it. It's set in 1972, and what it does, it uses names and situations from the then unpublished mainstream novels, which we covered on the channel a few weeks back. And Jim Ferguson, who's a character in Humpty Dumpty in Oakland, his name is reused in this, the spelling slightly different. And the name Stewart from Voices in the Street, the central character in Voices from the Street, Dick's first novel, is used for a key character in this book. So you're also seeing at the beginning of the book this depiction of Main Street, small town, California, USA in the 50s, except it's set in the 70s. They wouldn't know it. And basically the introductory character, the first person who appears, is Stuart McConchie, who is black. And this allows us to really flash back. You couldn't then, of course, as the books weren't published, but now you can flash back to the way that the black characters are depicted and are very secondary in the mainstream novels that Dick published about small town USA. And he has these sort of various retail-based, small business-based fictions, like Puttering About a Small Land is important because it ties to this book specifically, Humpty Dumpty in Oakland. And of course, there's even the retail aspects of The Man in the High Castle with Robert Children. So that's there a lot. And that's something I want to come back to later on. Stuart McConchie works in a TV repair store on this street in California. And this is a key location in the opening of the novel. And as I say, it's a location that echoes that same milieu, the TV repair shop and the TV shop in Puttering About in a Small Land. This time, however, even though he's black, McConchie is a key player, a black-focused character whose lifestyle and desires seem to echo that of the community later in the novel. And this, I think, is key to understanding what the book is actually about, at least on the surface. There's an awful lot to it, and it's a book that you could discuss from now to the end of time. There's plenty of philosophy in there, lots of great ideas, but I want to sort of focus on the immediate messages really in this. Also present in the milieu of the opening of the book is a disabled character, Hoppy Harrington. And Hoppy Harrington is the victim of thalidomide, the drug which in the early 60s, or a drug like thalidomide, which is prescribed to women as an antidepressant while they were pregnant, sort of prenatal depression drug. And of course, thalidomide, anybody's old enough will realise that, of course, it hadn't been properly tested and it caused terrible mutations. Children were born without limbs or with flippers rather than arms and what have you. And it really was a dreadful thing. It was stamped on very quickly, but nobody ever forgot it. And I can recall as a child hearing stories about it, and occasionally you'd see a thalidomide child, and it's a very, very, very sad thing. And Hoppy Harrington is one of these children. He has a sort of automated cart which he's wired into himself, and he grows in prowess throughout the story at technical things. And he doesn't have limbs and what have you, but he's very, very keen to work in the TV store and to learn how to repair TVs. But he's actually got some other kind of ability as well, which he keeps hidden. So these moments, looking at this sort of uterine past, they recur later in the novel, and in moments which I think echo something, and several things actually, which influenced David Cronenberg's Scanners, and we'll come back to that as well. Hoppy wants to work in the TV store on repairs. Stuart McConaughey doesn't really approve. He doesn't really think that it would work out. And he's witnessed a bizarre scrying session in the sort of local cafe where Stuart goes to get his lunch. And he doesn't think this is a good thing. Hoppy takes a drink and he manages to conjure up, well, I'll let you read that for yourself. But this is interesting because you have two characters from oppressed minorities and they're at loggerheads, and this is the way it would be differently depicted today. It wouldn't happen today. So you've basically got the man of colour and you have the less able person, and you know, they're not essentially sympathetically depicted, particularly Hoppy, who's quite a malign character, and that comes on. And you know, you could say this is because Dick was biased against these things, but it's nothing to do with that, and that wouldn't be Dick at all. It's very, very much that people have different ideas and have different ways of life, and just because somebody is in a minority doesn't mean they can't be malign. You know, it's the root of evil is in different places, different people, and you can't always assume that one type is virtuous or not, because that's stereotyping, that's patronizing, that's the worst thing of all, really. So Hoppy wants to work in the store, but Stuart isn't keen. And it does rather remind you of the source story for this book, Dick and Zelazny's D-Series, which is, this is a book club edition. I got this earlier this week, and really good nick. The Gollocks hardcover is harder to find, and yellow, of course. And I'm going to reread this because I haven't read this for a long time. And this evolved out of a story called The Kneeling Legless Man. So it's interesting because Hoppy is on this cart, and there's a kind of similarity to The Kneeling Legless Man in D-Series. And Blood Money, in the meantime, while this retail scenario is going on, he is seeking psychiatric help. He's using a pseudonym, and once upon a time he predicted that a high altitude nuclear test wouldn't, if it was undertaken, wouldn't harm anybody, but unfortunately it did, and it irradiated some clouds, and there have been some deaths, mutations from this. So he's kind of infamous, this person, and he's seeking psychiatric help at a surgery just down the street from the TV repair store. Now, simultaneously to this happening, NASA are sending a husband and wife, Walt Dangerfield and his wife, to Mars because they want to get the recolonization program started, and it's a new start. And of course, what's interesting is this is set in 1972, and that's the point when, you know, NASA started to pull back on the space program. It's also the point when Barry Milesberg's Beyond Apollo, critiquing that, came along. The Falling Astronauts and Revelations were sequels to that. So there is this critique of the space program in this as well. And people at the TV store and outside looking through the window, and they're watching the blast off on TV. So this is going on, and then somebody runs into the TV store and shouts "Red Alert," the title of the Peter George novel. And of course, Red Alert, it's a cliche, it's a well-known thing that people would shout if there was a bomb test or an air raid or something like that. And everybody realizes the nuclear bombs are going off up above the atmosphere, and Dr. Bloodmoney has this revelation that it's an accidental automatic defense system's been triggered. So it's America actually bombing itself. It's the SDI Star Wars thing where everything goes off, and there isn't actually a war, but there is a nuclear holocaust. So that's the setup. That sort of covers about the first 50 pages of the book. There's lots of other details as well, so these aren't spoilers. It's just to give you the basic fleshing out of how things kick off in the main narrative of the novel. The rest of the book takes place in this post-nuclear California, which is trying really to slowly rebuild towards a re-industrialized society with all the services that people enjoyed before the Holocaust, and they really want to get back to that. And basically what's happened in the intervening years, I think about 7 years past, is that Stewart, Dr. Bloodmoney and Hoppy are among the survivors. Some characters don't survive. And Hoppy is mutating and growing increasingly more malign and malevolent and developing psionic powers. So it's got all this strange mix of things in it, which is very Van Voghtian, very, very much Dick's key influence from the Golden Age. And also Walt Dangerfield, the astronaut, he managed to get into space, but his spacecraft is stuck in orbit around Earth. He can't get to Mars. His wife has passed away. And he is broadcasting via radio down to Earth. He's reading from a few books which he has on tape, and he's broadcasting music. And he's doing this while he's orbiting the Earth. And people all over the English-speaking world are tuning in and listening to him. And there aren't many radios left. They're mostly sort of blasted by the EMP. And people gather in this small town at the local hall the same time every night, as Dangerfield's spaceship passes across their part of the planet, and that's what you see on the cover. That's Dangerfield's spaceship there, drawn by Peter Elson. Lovely stuff. And it's very, very much an old school thing, people gathering around the radio as if it was a fire with the lights and what have you. The way that people used to listen to radio before TV, because the media has pretty much been destroyed with the exception of locally produced papes, which are very gossipy and sensational. So you get other characters emerging at this point, particularly Bonnie Keller, who's kind of an Earth Mother, sensual, attractive woman, and everybody seems to sort of lust after her. And this is a typical Dick novel in that it has too many peripheral characters, and many of these characters are just names, and they pop up and they're functions, and instead of like mentioning a name, then you get a comma and a line saying who they are, just to use them as functionaries to get things moving across the plot. They are mentioned a few times, but they don't really come to life. And it's not as bad as, say, the Simulacra, where there are something like 22 characters and no real focus. It's really hard to keep things in mind, and Dick, when he did that well, he was really good at it, but there were times when he lost control of it. It's a very difficult thing to do. The thing with Dr. Bloodmoney, I think that's actually the weakest part of the book. I think some of the characters have been pared away and it could have been tightened and sharpened, but it is still really good. The prose is very, very arid. It's as arid as the irradiated milieu that the plot and the characters inhabit. It's not really upholstered with surface in the same as the best books like Android or Ubik are. But having said that, it does have lots of colour, like there's a horse with an interesting name, and you do buy into it. And it is one of his longer books. It's 290 pages long, which is long for PKD at that point, and is long for an SF novel at that point as well, even though we were starting to see long things like Dune and Stand on Zanzibar popping up in the 60s. So besides Bonnie, she is almost like a fulcrum, and she is central, but she's an enabler rather than a prime mover. She does or says things which spark things off. But more important is her little daughter, Edie. Now, Edie starts off as fairly minor, but she really becomes the locus of the plot as the book develops, because she has an imaginary brother called Bill. Now, Bill is actually anything but imaginary, or is he? And Bill's presence acts very much as a foil for Hoppy Harrington as he becomes more malign, and this is where it reminded me of Scanners quite a lot. In David Cronenberg's Scanners, Vale and Revok are brothers, separated when they're young, created in utero by accident by a drug called ephemeral, which sounds like ephemeral. It's not going to have any effect. And of course, ephemeral, unknown to Dr. Paul Ruth, its creator in Scanners, actually makes babies into telepaths. And Paul Ruth in Scanners is rather like Dr. Bloodmoney. He's a typical scientist who hasn't considered what the details and what could happen, what contingency could take over from the tech and create a whole new paradigm. So really, Bill and Hoppy remind me of a moment in Scanners, the moment where the central female lead, late in the narrative, is being scanned by a child which is still in utero, in a womb, sitting in a waiting room. at a doctor's, and a woman is pregnant with a child, and the child is scanning her telepathically, and that has analogues to things that happen in Dr. Bloodmoney. So it's another example of Dick's influence over Cronenberg and other sort of artists of many kinds. So Bill also echoes Philip K. Dick's deceased twin sister, which some of you will know about. When Dick was born, he was born 6 weeks premature, about 20 minutes before his sister Jane, and they were twins. And obviously they weren't identical twins because they'd been the same sex. And Jane expired after about a month and a half. Both the children were sort of undernourished, premature, born in the late 20s was a tough thing. And she was burned accidentally by Dick's careless mother with a hot water bottle, and Dick sort of blamed his mother and her lack of care for Jane's death after that. Interestingly, my own father was born 2 months premature in 1937, and that affected his health all his life. And I too was actually burned on the leg as a very small infant by a health visitor who was careless with a kettle, and I had a really, really nasty burn, apparently. So, and initially my mother was blamed, but it wasn't her, it was this health visitor who tried to cover it up. So I do feel a kind of affinity here to that part of the narrative, and that really came home to me when I was reading it. So Dick then felt the absence of Jane all his life, and if you go to where they're buried in California, they're buried side by side together, and on the headstone there's a little cat's head as well, because PKD loved cats. And you know, he often said, and he said this in his exegesis and other places, that Jane was his female half, but who was absent, but she sort of created the female half of his psyche. It's a very Jungian sort of thing, and Dick was into all that, of course, as you know. And as a kid, PKD had an imaginary friend called Teddy, and as I say, in this novel, the little girl Edie has an imaginary brother, Bill. So there's all these sort of connections. There's also a connection to owls. There's an owl there on that lamp. And of course the owl is the first creature which becomes extinct in Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep. The owl is a symbol of wisdom and sagacity. You know, Sage the Owl from the Herbs, you remember the kid show if you're British. And of course the book that Dick was going to write when he died was called The Owl in Daylight, so out of place. And an owl comes into this at the climax of the book. That's not a spoiler because there's no way you know what significance or not the owl has. But yeah, Dick obviously used it as a symbol of wisdom. It's quite interesting stuff. And the book builds to a fascinating, fabulous, really, really strange climax, which, you know, he pulls out all the stops, and it's really absolutely stunning stuff. And he has such facility with this shaping of this strangeness into a narrative that makes sense. And about the book overall, you'll want to read it for yourself, but so what do critics think of it? I mean, Kim Stanley Robinson sees the post-apocalyptic California that's created by this nuclear accident as being an opportunity to escape from capitalism and to have a utopian situation. And he compares it a little to things like more gentle sort of post-apocalyptic things like On the Beach by Neville Shute, which isn't that gentle because there's about 5 people left alive and, you know, they're all going to die. And Pat Frank's The Last Babylon, which is a very, very gentle post-apocalypse novel, and we'll cover that at some point in the channel because it's really discussed these days. But really, when you look at the characters, listening to Walt Dangerfield doing his broadcasts, and they get very concerned when they think that Walt is ill and so on, you know, really, they're longing for other things. They're longing for cigarettes and alcohol, for the mail service to come back, for transport to come back, for manufacturing to get going again. They really want the comforts of capitalism to return, and this is embodied in the character of Stuart McConaughey, who really comes to a realization about what he was like before and how he hasn't changed, and he still wants the same things. And, you know, Dick celebrates this sort of small business, independent sort of capitalism thing, because of course he worked on that a lot in the 1950s in his life, and he could see the pleasure of bringing culture into small business through running the record store and things like that he did. And the characters seek comfort. In a way, it has a strange analogue with the way our high streets are going now, at least in the UK, where small specialist shops are shutting down, everybody's buying anything online, and our reasons for going into city centres are changing. We just go for a coffee and a cake now. So it kind of shows the decline of culture and how there aren't physical locuses anymore for us to attend to where we find culture. And I did a video on the channel about a year and a half ago called The Psychogeography of Mill Street, which is about a small street in my hometown where I feel my imagination was born, where I bought certain records and books and toys. And you might want to look at that, because it will make you think about where in your life, if you're above a certain age, you first discover culture and where you went to seek it out. Now, of course, we seek it out online, as you're doing now, as we're doing now. So that's Dr. Bloodmoney, or How We Got Along After the Bomb. I would say give it a try. It is a great book. And I just thought I'd show you some of the upgrades that I've done recently. And as I say, I managed to get a lovely upgrade there, and Broken Spine, absolutely beautiful. And I just, you know, even though I've read all these books and I've always had them, when you see really nice editions, I'm at that stage now where I'm trying to get the final library together, as I keep saying now and again. So I just bought a few things which are very beautiful. And this is an early Panther of an early PKD, the World Jones made. Look at that, isn't that gorgeous? I do like these little Panther ovals with the oval down there. Absolutely lovely. And that's a very minor novel. And recently I sold my ace copy of that, which was an earlier US copy. I managed to get a pristine copy of Martian Timeslip, and I've still got my original I bought for 45p way back in the early 80s, and which I'll keep for sentimental reasons as a reading copy. So I'm keeping the extras as reading copies, and I've got a hardcover first of this as well. Absolutely fantastic. And you know, as much as I would like a Jonathan Cape Penultimate Truth, as I said in my video with Bob recently, there's a really nice Penguin which I picked up recently, and great book. Love that book. Fantastic stuff. We'll come on to that one at some point as well. And a book which I have in a Methuen paperback. This is a, let's see, this is a Grafton from the late 80s, and I just thought I wanted another copy. That's Counterclock World. And of course, at this point things were starting to flip into B, and Counterclock World is a great one if you haven't read it. But I think the nicest one I've got recently is one that you very, very, very rarely see, and I've very rarely seen it. And this is a Fontana edition of We Can Build You from the late 70s. Isn't that absolutely gorgeous? Lovely. And you don't see that very much. You don't see much PKD in the wild these days anyway. And if you've got something like Hay on Wye, there hasn't been any PKD in Hay on Wye for like decades, and except for more recent editions. So yeah, that's really lovely. And you know, I've got my Seven House hardcover. There you go, from the late 80s. Absolutely beautiful. And the Grafton one at that time had this as well. And this is a first person narrative as well. And there's retail stuff in there as well, which is quite interesting. So there's a few little PKD paperback upgrades for you. And that's an insight into some of my feelings about Dr. Bloodmoney. Even though I've put a lot of detail in there about characters and plot, you must read it for yourself because there's more to it. It is one of his wackiest books, one of his wildest books, and one of his most accomplished. So do get out there and enjoy it, because there is more to PKD than the 3 or 4 which we keep hearing about, and this is certainly in the second or maybe the first tier. This is Outlaw Bookseller signing out for now. Bye.